Good point.
All right, welcome to the 1020 lecture on introductions to drama. We are going to cover quite a bit of territory this evening. So we'll be working, this will be a posted lecture, so you can always come back later if you need to and begin the process of reviewing the lecture. Let me kind of lay the overarching schematas, and then from there we'll move on to the information in detail. We're going to look in basically three directions this evening in the lecture. One, we're going to look very far into the past, to the ancient Greeks, who will introduce us to the concept of drama. For those of us who have sometimes said sheepishly, I haven't read the book but I've seen the movie, feeling somehow, like we're a lesser person because we haven't read the book but seen the movie, you're in good company. For thousands of years, before anybody ever read a book, they saw the movie. That is to say, drama and poetic interpretation is the oldest form of entertainment on the planet. Got me? So we'll go all the way back to a cat named Aristotle. That's where we're going to begin. I'll be there in a moment. Then we're going to go to what some consider to be the high moment of drama during the English Renaissance by a writer that we all, of course, know as Shakespeare. What's ironic is that many debate whether Shakespeare even actually existed as the Shakespeare that we believe him to be. Well, whoever Shakespeare was, the cat could write some plays, and he did. We've, of course, read and viewed Othello, and so I'll spend the majority of my time there, along with his comedy Midsummer Night's Dream. We'll talk about Elizabethan drama. The reason we call it Elizabethan and often not Shakespearean is that Shakespeare lived during the time of the great Queen Elizabeth, who, by the way, loved drama. She loved it. She loved to go to the plays. She loved to have them perform for her. If it wasn't for her support, there's a good argument that Shakespeare would have never made it. Okay? Finally, that's the second view. Again, the first view, looking backwards to the Greeks. The second view, looking at roughly 1600 Common Era. And finally, we will then look at American drama. And we'll look at two offerings. One, the Arthur Miller play Death of a Salesman, and then finally the short play Trifles, as a work of feminist critique of feminist literature. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. To do that, we're going to have to get right into it. All right. And again, if I move rather quickly, you can always go back. You can watch the lecture that's posted at learnstrong.net under 1020, and you can. And this one will be posted as Introduction to Drama. That's what we'll call it. When you go back in time, and again, just to make sure we're all on board with this idea, you've got a timeline where you've got 0 as the birth of Christ, right? And then we talk about events, we break these up into 100-year segments, right? We talk about events which occur before the Common Era, right, BCE, and then that's going backwards in time, and then events that are from the 0, the birth of Christ, going forward, Common Era. By the way, we used to call this BC and AD, right? Okay. Now, if you go back in time, by the way, remember, these numbers count down towards 0, correct? Okay. If you go back in time, let's call it roughly 400 BCE, okay? 500 to 400 BCE, all right? It's there that we have the great introduction of the Greek period, right? The Greeks. The Greeks gave us so much for our Western culture. Tonight we're going to focus on the drama that the Greeks gave to us. Okay. But the Greeks saw drama in a very particular way. For them, going to a play was like going to church for them. It was a religious experience. In the spring, see, MTV didn't invent spring break. The Greeks did. The Greeks did. In the spring, all of the people would come together at the city of Athens or Thebes. And they would all get together they would all get pretty intoxicated, and they would do a certain amount of hanky-panky. Let's just keep it PG-13 tonight. Thanks, Mr. McGee. And then, when in the middle of those kinds of crazy orgy-like experiences, they would then break, and they would all go into an arena where they would watch plays being performed. Okay? For them, going to the play was a spiritual or a religious experience. The great philosopher Nietzsche will comment on this years later, right at the end of the 19th century, and he will say, this is what's different about the Greeks versus modern culture in Europe. In modern culture in Europe, think about it today, you have two different things. You go to the movie on a Friday night, that's one kind of form of entertainment. And then on Sunday morning, some people still go to church, where they go into a house of worship. That's a different kind of experience, not for the Greeks. For the Greeks, those were the same thing. They saw it as the same thing. That's important. Now, the greatest of the Greek writers is a guy named Sophocles. Okay? Sophocles, who will have written the famous trilogy of plays, that's 3 plays together, right? Oedipus Rex, Rex is just Latin for king. Oedipus at Colonus is the second play. It tells the story of Oedipus' death. And then the third of the 3 plays, Antigone. Those 3 plays taken collectively we call the trinity of the Sophoclean deviant plays. Okay? Now, a few years later, you're going to have the famous trilogy of philosophers. All right? Philosophers. Now, what are philosophers? These are important thinkers who ask really important questions and sometimes try and answer those questions. That's what a philosopher is. The word literally means a lover of wisdom. Now, you have 3 famous philosophers of the Greeks. The first is a guy named Socrates. Now, don't confuse Socrates with Sophocles. Sophocles is the playwright. Socrates is the philosopher. Socrates, in 399 BCE, 399 BCE, Socrates is brought to trial by the Athenians. The Athenians are the people who live in Athens. Athens is the capital city of all of Greece. Put on trial because they say he is an atheist, doesn't believe in God, and he's a corrupter of the youth. He teaches kids bad things, and then they turn out to be atheists themselves. And for that accusation, or accusations, 2 of them, he's put on trial. In 399, they find him guilty, and they make him drink hemlock, a form of poison, and he dies. So they kill him. As an old man, he's like 70 years old, and they kill him. Socrates, however, had a student who was there and watched the experience of that trial. His name was Plato. Now, that's not that stuff you played with when you were a kid. That's Plato. This is Plato. Okay? Plato watches this trial. He is so outraged. He's a young gun. He was supposed to go to Harvard and then go to a law school and become a big shot. Instead, he decides to not do that. When he sees what they do to his teacher, Socrates, for the rest of his life, Plato devotes himself to himself being a philosopher. If you will, he follows in his teacher's footsteps. It's through Plato that he writes famous dialogues, okay, of which 2 of these dialogues, by the way, what's a dialogue? If I'm having a dialogue with Miss Trimbath, I talk, then she talks. Then I talk, then she talks. In these dialogues, almost always one of the interlocutors or speakers is Socrates, and the other is somebody else. The probably 2 most famous dialogues, since we're here, and I just want you to be aware of it. We are in a lit class, so it makes sense that you would at least be aware of these titles. The first is the Apology, which tells the story of Socrates being on trial for his life. In this dialogue called Apology, he has a very famous saying or quote. He says, "The unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living." In other words, Socrates will teach that if you're going to live a good life, that's defined by examining or looking at your life, about any action that you would commit, asking, why am I doing this? Is it the right thing to do? The other famous dialogue, along with Apology, is Republic. Republic. Republic is a long dialogue, and here Socrates will present, or Plato will present, some of the most famous ideas in politics, in education, in psychology, in sociology. When you go to a university and you see all those different departments, almost every one of those departments are defined in some way in Republic. Many say it's the most famous single text in the history of Western thought. Okay? Plato had a student. His name was Aristotle. Okay? Aristotle. Aristotle studies with Plato, and he becomes, like Plato, a philosopher. What makes Aristotle the most important in many ways of these three is that Aristotle creates systems of thought. He formulates what we call taxonomies, or systems of thought. He invents the science of logic. He invents the science of biology. You know how when you had to take biology and there were those classification systems with those charts and you had to memorize all? Aristotle invents all of that stuff. One other thing that Aristotle does, and this is our topic of this evening, is Aristotle is very interested in drama. And he writes a famous text called Poetics. Poetics. If we're going to talk about drama, we need to talk about poetics. So that's where we'll start this evening. Okay? Now that's roughly, 300 years, 350 years, 400 years before Christ's birth. Okay? Then what we will do is skip ahead to the year 1600. This is the easy working date for Shakespeare. Okay? Shakespeare. All right? The reason 1600 is an easy working date for us is because 1600 is the year that Shakespeare wrote and performed, we believe, his greatest play. What was Shakespeare's greatest play? It wasn't Othello. What was it? It was not Romeo and Juliet. What was it? Most famous play. The lines, to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Hamlet.
Yes.
The most famous of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet. 1600. We'll use this as a good working date. Now wait a minute. We call that time period the Renaissance. The Renaissance, which means, literally, rebirth. I like a different term though. I like the term rediscovery. Okay? Now for example, if my son finally decides to clean his bedroom, this would be a miracle of all miracles, and he pulls his bed out from the wall, and sitting on the floor underneath his bed is a CD of music. If he rediscovers the CD of music, what does that mean? He had it, he lost it, and then he found it again, right? That's different from discovering a CD. When he pulls the bed out from the wall and, whoa, where'd that come from? That's discovery. Rediscovery. You have it, you lose it, you rediscover it. We call 1600 the time of the Renaissance, or rediscovery. What is it that we are rediscovering? And the answer is, are you ready for this? The important classic texts of the Greek, and of course the Roman writers. And more particularly a certain view that these Greek and Roman writers had. Okay? Especially for Shakespeare, very influenced by these early Greek writers. Okay? No text more influential for Shakespeare than Aristotle's Poetics. Okay? Now, if you'll think about 1600, Columbus sails the ocean blue in what? 1492, which is 8 years from 1500, which is 100 years before 1600. Tommy and his pals write, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That's a classic text in American thought that we call the Declaration of Independence. We even measure the birth date of our country from the writing of that document. What year was that? Do you remember? It's the birth date of our country, 1776. So you can get a timeline picture here, right? Roughly 176 years after Hamlet, Jefferson's writing this classic text of the Declaration of Independence, etc., etc. Finally, here we go with 1950, and this will be our classic American dramas that we'll look at the end of class or the lecture. Again, Miller's Death of Salesman and the play Trifles. Okay? So, just to give you a sense of where we're headed, we're going to start first of all with Aristotle's Poetics and his definition of drama. Then we're going to talk about the ways that Shakespeare understood those ideas, and then he changed in many ways those ideas. He built on them. And then finally we will finish with ideas regarding how American authors changed again. It's always kind of an ongoing change. All right? Any questions about kind of the historic schemata as we're working with it? Okay, give me a second to get rid of this stuff on the board, and we'll then get on with the second part of our lecture. Go ahead now and find, if you would please, in your notes, Aristotle's Poetics now. And that's where we're going to start. Aristotle lives after Sophocles. He wants to try to define what makes Sophocles such an important writer, especially the play Oedipus Rex. So Aristotle writes this classic text called Poetics. Okay? Poetics. Now, while it sounds like it ought to be about poetry, the text itself is actually about drama. Okay? So he's going to try to define what makes great drama. All right? So when we look at this text, that's kind of where we're going. About the classic text, and for Aristotle, he assigns the greatest play of his time to Oedipus Rex. Okay? A text we'll talk about in a moment. About that text, he says, it's the greatest play, and here's why. He says, great drama does several things. The first thing great drama does is there is a protagonist. Okay, a protagonist. By the way, Mr. Perez, what would be the opposite of the protagonist? The antagonist, right? The protagonist is the individual in the play with whom the audience, and that's a key word, most identifies. Okay? Now, what does that mean?
And usually the good guy.
What does it mean the audience most identifies with? What does that mean? It's the character that the audience looks at and feels for. That feels for is an important thing. Now, for Aristotle, he doesn't just stop here. And you heard Mr. Perez say, often the protagonist is the good guy of the play. Yes and no. We'll sometimes even recognize how the protagonist of a play may not be who you necessarily like, but for the Greek audience, it's the character in the play they most identify with. That is, they most feel with. But wait a minute. For Aristotle, there are two kinds of drama. There's what he called tragedy, and there's what he called comedy. Okay? Now, sadly, we do not know anymore what Aristotle's views regarding comedy really were. But we kind of have a sense that he saw tragedy as way more important than comedy. Does it surprise you at all that every spring, usually in the month of February or March, that a whole bunch of very wealthy people dress up in the most remarkable clothes? Some of those dresses are in the thousands of dollars. They drive in front of a building that has a long red carpet. Paparazzi and cameras are everywhere. They get out of their limousines. They walk into that building. The wealthiest and most powerful people in all of America sit in that room. And somebody comes to the front of this stage, or in front of all of them, and says, the very best movie this year was this movie, and then names it. And nobody in that group stands up and says, what are you talking about? You can't like say about art which is the best and which is the worst, because art is all about people's tastes. For example, the year that Dumb and Dumber was released, it made way more money than the film that won Best Picture of the Year. Therefore, a lot of people thought probably that was the best picture of the year. Guess what? Dumb and Dumber did not win any Academy Awards. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look, it's fascinating. Rarely do comedies win Best Picture of the Year in the Academy Awards. Why is it that they always have to be those really sad movies that, you know, kind of are like really dramatic? The answer is Aristotle. Aristotle from Poetics on said, tragedy is more important than comedy, and here's why. In a tragedy, you have a protagonist who will begin high, I'll explain what that means, and end low, okay? The movement of the protagonist in the play is to begin high. That means he is a person of elevated power, usually a king or somebody important. And by the end of the play, he ends jagged, either dead or destroyed. Okay? Now this ending low, this fall, what Aristotle called it hamartia, okay, which means tragic fall, is because of a fault called hubris, or excessive pride. Okay? Excessive pride. In other words, the audience goes to the play and it watches this protagonist go through the experience of falling. But the fall does not make the audience go, yay, he got jacked. No. When the protagonist falls and gets jacked, the audience goes, ah. In fact, it's the response of the audience that Aristotle's most intrigued with. Now, this is fascinating to me. Most of us think that when we go to watch a play or go to watch a movie, that the real action is what's happening on the stage. So, for example, if you were to go and watch the play Othello, you're sitting in the audience, actors dress up, they put makeup on, out comes Desdemona, out comes Othello, and in the end he suffocates her, blah, blah, blah. And you would think that the action is on the stage and you are watching it. Aristotle says, no, you missed it. What do you mean I missed it? He says the real action isn't what happens on stage. The real drama is what happens in the audience. As the audience watches what happens on stage, it's like a mirror is held up to them. They look into the play and they see themselves reflected back again. In other words, as this protagonist falls, the audience will have powerful feelings. These feelings, Aristotle called catharsis, or purgation. Okay? Purgation comes from our word to purge, right? Okay. Catharsis comes from our word to let go, to release. That's what that word means. In other words, what are these feelings of catharsis or purgation? Two of them. One, we feel fear. In other words, as something bad happens to the protagonist, we think, oh, crap, that could happen to me someday. Fear. Fear. The second powerful emotion that we feel as we watch the protagonist fall is pity. Sometimes we call it sympathy. Okay? Sympathy. In other words, we look at what happens. It's like one of my freshmen once said, well, basically that means that you look at whatever happens to the protagonist and you say, I'm glad it happened to him and not to me. Well, not quite, okay? That's kind of a hard way to look at it. Rather, what happens is that you look at this person falling and you go, oh, man, that really stinks. That's so sad. I feel bad for that person. Got me? Now, Aristotle studied biology. That means he looked at animals. He asked a really intriguing question. If you own a dog, Chris, do you own a dog? Have you ever had a dog? Yeah. So, here it goes. This is the question. Aristotle asked this question. at first you laugh at the question, you go, what a silly question. But Aristotle, because he's a philosopher, will ask a question that sounds really simple, and then he will make you think about it. Here's the question. What is the difference between Perez and his dog?
I got a couple.
Now, Lorena is going to say, she has an idea or two, but she's not going to say it now. But here's the funny thing. After all the joking is aside, Aristotle says, no, I'm serious. For example, does Perez and his dog both have skin? Both have a brain?
Yeah.
Can they both use that brain? They both have lungs. They both breathe air. I'll go back to the question again. Now all of a sudden it ain't no funny question. What's the difference between Perez and his dog? You do realize everything that Perez can do, his dog can do. Don't tell me that Perez's dog can't do math, because there's a whole lot of things I can tell you that Perez can't do that his dog can do. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but he's just more productive than his dog.
In what ways? See, here again, now what you call more productive.
He gets more done in a day than a dog does.
See, Perez might argue, I don't know, some
And
days
he
that
just
dog
wants
is,
brown
someday that
wagon.
dog is busy, I don't know. Here's the answer, by the
That's
way.
true.
Aristotle's answer is a really intriguing one. He says it this way. This is kind of my take on Aristotle. Aristotle says about Perez and his dog, both of them can look at a sunset. Only one of them can appreciate it. Think about this. This is a profound moment in Western thought when Aristotle stumbles onto this idea. Both Perez and his dog can look at the sun going down. Only one of the two of them can go, oh, that is so beautiful. Only one of the two of them. Think about it. This is what we call appreciation. For example, both Perez and his dog can listen to music. Only one of them is actually capable of really enjoying that music, or so we think.
Yes.
Yeah.
That appreciation. That appreciation, Aristotle gave a name to. He called it aesthetics. It means to appreciate beauty. Okay? Aristotle argued that it is in this movement of the fall of the protagonist that the audience experiences fear and pity, that we actually become human. Now, this is a profound moment in the history of thought. Aristotle says, when you lose the capacity to feel pity and sympathy for another human being, you no longer are human. You cease to be human. At that point, Perez and his dog, no difference. No difference. Another way to say this is, both Perez and his dog can have sex. This is how Aristotle said it too. Both Perez and his dog can have sex, but only one of them understands love. Now that's an interesting idea. The argument is that the dog can only experience copulation, but cannot experience the notion of love. As humans understand love. Why? Because love is connected to the notion of the other. Sympathy, respect for the other, concern for the other. Where do we learn this? Aristotle says we're not born with this. He says we learn this, and the way we learn it is through drama. So that's why going to the play is like going to church for Aristotle. He sees it as a spiritual or a religious experience because it changes the audience. Now we can jump ahead real quickly to a really interesting phenomenon that happened a few years ago on the stage. Screen, film. We don't watch as much play as we watch film. The same rules apply. 2 years before DiCaprio and his film Titanic was released, I was in Japan and already hearing about it. People were already buzzing about this film. By the time the film was released, it was already being spoken of as a really important film. Which is really remarkable, because it's a 3-hour film that can be reduced to a single line, the boat sings. And before anybody went in to see the movie, everybody already knew the boat sings. Agreed? And yet this film was a phenom. It sold up to its time more tickets. In fact, when they did studies 3 months into the showing of this film, they realized that over 1/3 of the people who saw the film the first time had gone back to see it a second time. And it obviously begged the question, what is it about this film, more than any other film, that keeps bringing people back? Why this film? For example, DiCaprio and Winslet had been in other films, hadn't done that well. There had been lots of historical dramas that tried to, kind of show you what had happened before. None of them made this kind of money. The question was a very simple one. Aristotle held the key to answering it. And if you saw that movie, especially in the theater, you know that there was a certain kind of emotional response on the part of the audience. I intentionally didn't go the first week it was released. It actually was released here in New Orleans that year. I didn't go. I was interested in hearing my students talk about the film. And I asked them, so, how was it? And they would always say the same thing to me in that first week. It's really strange. I mean, it was a great film, but I can't explain it. I went to the movie. It was 3 hours, but it didn't seem long to me. And when I walked out of the film, I was tired, physically tired, like I had been running or something. But several of my students said the weird thing was that outside of the theater, people just kind of stood in little groups and kind of talked. It left you in a strange state of mind, the film. Many of my students reported that even that week, they went back again to see the film a second time. I think Aristotle gives us an answer as to why, and it's got nothing to do with the boat sinking. This is the point. James Cameron, the maker of the film, has constructed a moment on film that seems so unbelievably real that individuals sitting there in the theater can get caught up in the moment. The boat hits the ice cube. It gets ready to start sinking. Listen to that film teach an audience. There are several different responses, isn't there? One, there's the scummy guy who tries to get off the boat onto the other boat. He's kind of seen as the guy who, he's not a real good guy. It begs the question, if you were on a boat that you knew was going to go down in the cold water of the North Atlantic, how would you respond? Would you run and try and get on the other boat to get away? But wait a minute, there's other pictures. What about the picture below deck, where the mother is telling the story to her 2 children, knowing full well they're all about to drown? Or the 2 lovers lying in bed as old married couple who are embracing each other as the boat is about to go down. In other words, what this movie does is it constructs in the mind of audience viewers a demanding challenge. It is Aristotle's question. What would I do if I was in the same situation? We all would like to think we would be heroic in a moment like that. And yet this film makes us wonder. And so I think a large number of people went back to watch the film again for that reason. Now for Aristotle, the key of all keys was to play Oedipus Rex. Okay? Let's talk about it for a second. Sophocles' first play in that famous trilogy. Well, what is this play? Well, it's a famous, of course, enough storyline. Oedipus is born to the king of Thebes. A blind prophet comes in on the night of his birth and says, uh-oh. Tiresias says, uh-oh. He can see the future. Uh-oh. If you don't kill this kid, he will grow up. He will kill you, king of Thebes, Lais. He will marry with his mother, Jacusta, and he'll have 4 children by her. Now, I should point out that during the time this play is written, not all cultures on this planet see incest as a terrible thing. You know, of course, of the Egyptian dynasties where you only married within your family, incest. But for the Greeks, there is nothing worse than incest. Okay? But the king can't kill his son, so he does the next best thing. In mythology, this is a motif. He takes him out on a mountainside and he leaves him there to be eaten by a wild animal. Oedipus isn't eaten by a wild animal. He's found by a shepherd who takes him to another city named Corinth where Oedipus grows up. But in Greek mythology, if you're the son of a king, you grow up to look like Brad Pitt, strong and stunning and handsome and all those things. He's at a party one night in Corinth. He bumps up against an old prophet. The prophet repels from him and says, uh-oh, you're cursed. He goes, dude, what do you mean I'm cursed? I get any girl I want. He goes, no, no, no. You're going to kill your dad and marry your mom. He's like, what is wrong with you? And the prophet says, I'm never wrong. You're going to kill your dad and marry your mom. Oedipus decides, I don't want to do that. So he decides to leave Corinth so he doesn't kill his dad and marry his mom. He's never told that he was a foundling. He thinks his mom and dad in Corinth are his real mom and dad.